The last thing Skylar Little expected when she walked into the San Diego Convention Center that Tuesday morning was to challenge a millionaire in front of 300 architects and urban planners. But there she was, standing at the microphone during the Q&A session, her voice steady despite her racing heart, asking Gavin Keller the question that would change both their lives forever. "Mr. Keller, your modular housing proposal looks impressive on paper, but how do you plan to implement it in underserved communities without displacing the very families you claim to help?" The silence that followed was deafening. She watched as his confident smile faltered for just a moment, his green eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unexpected awareness. Gavin had given this presentation dozens of times across the globe, from Stockholm to Singapore, from Amsterdam to Austin. His PowerPoint was polished to perfection, his talking points memorized, his responses to anticipated questions rehearsed until they flowed like water. But no one had ever cut through his carefully constructed rhetoric quite like this unknown woman in the third row. Her question was not just intelligent, it was devastating in its accuracy, exposing the very flaw in his business model that kept him awake at 3 in the morning. He found himself genuinely pausing, his usual smooth recovery mechanism failing him completely. The woman had shoulder-length curly hair that caught the convention center lights, warm brown skin, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she was not easily impressed by wealth or status. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, nothing flashy or attention-seeking, but there was something about her presence that commanded the room's focus. "That is an excellent question," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that surprised even him, and honestly, one that deserves more than a soundbite answer. The truth is, sustainable development without community displacement requires partnerships with local organizations, extensive resident consultation, and sometimes admitting that our solutions need to be completely reimagined. Their eyes met across the auditorium, and something electric passed between them. Something that had nothing to do with sustainable architecture and everything to do with the way she tilted her chin when she spoke. The passion that burned in her dark eyes when she talked about social justice. The rest of his presentation felt different after that moment, more honest, less performative. Yes. He found himself looking at her repeatedly, noting how she took careful notes, how she nodded when he made points about environmental responsibility, how she frowned slightly when he discussed profit margins. By the time he concluded his talk, Gavin realized he cared more about impressing this one critical audience member than he did about the entire room. After the conference ended, Skylar was gathering her notes and preparing to head back to her cramped studio apartment when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find Gavin Keller himself standing there, no longer the polished speaker from the stage, but somehow more real, more human. His perfectly styled brown hair was slightly mussed, his tie loosened, and there was something almost vulnerable about the way he stood there, as if he was not quite sure of his welcome. "I never got your name," he said, extending his hand with a smile that was entirely different from his public persona, warmer, more genuine, tinged with something that might have been nervousness. "Gavin Keller." "Skylar Little," she replied, accepting his handshake. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her system, his palm warm and calloused in a way that surprised her. She had expected soft businessman hands, not the grip of someone who actually worked with his hands. "And I apologize if my question seemed aggressive. Do not apologize," he interrupted, his voice firm but warm. "That was the most important question I have been asked all year. Hell, possibly in the last 5 years. Would you have coffee with me? I would like to continue this conversation, and I have a feeling you have more insights that could actually help me solve some problems I have been struggling with." Skylar hesitated, studying his face for signs of condescension or the kind of patronizing interest wealthy men sometimes showed toward causes they thought were cute. Instead, she found genuine curiosity and something that looked almost like relief, as if he had been waiting for someone to call him out on his blind spots. "I suppose I could spare an hour," she said finally, though something in her chest fluttered with anticipation that had nothing to do with professional networking. What Skylar did not know was that in 12 hours, her phone would ring with an offer that would sound completely insane. What Gavin did not know was that this sharp-tongued architect would become the one person capable of seeing past his carefully constructed walls. Neither of them knew that a fake engagement would lead to the most real thing either had ever experienced, or that their first night living together would involve takeout Chinese food, terrible jokes, and the kind of conversation that lasts until dawn because neither person wants it to end. But first, there was coffee. And sometimes that is exactly where love stories begin, with a simple question that changes everything, and the courage to ask for more time to find the answer together. As they walked out of the convention center side by side, both pretending not to notice how perfectly their steps matched, the San Diego afternoon sun painted everything golden with possibility. The coffee shop near Balboa Park buzzed with afternoon energy. Students hunched over laptops, business people conducting meetings over lattes, tourists studying maps and guidebooks. But Skylar barely noticed the world around her. Gavin had chosen a corner table, strategically positioned away from curious eyes and potential eavesdroppers, and for the past hour they had been deep in conversation about everything from urban planning theories to childhood dreams to the ethics of gentrification. She found herself genuinely surprised by his depth, his willingness to admit when he did not have all the answers. The public Gavin Keller was all confidence and polished solutions, but this version, sleeves rolled up, tie completely abandoned, gesturing enthusiastically as he described a housing project that had failed spectacularly in Portland, was infinitely more interesting. "You grew up here in San Diego?" he asked, stirring his espresso with deliberate precision. There was something almost nervous about the gesture, which was odd for someone who presumably commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. His hands were elegant but practical, she noticed, with a thin scar across his left knuckle that suggested he had not always lived behind a desk. "Born and raised in Normal Heights," Skylar replied, tucking a strand of her curly hair behind her ear. The gesture was unconscious, but it made Gavin's attention focus on the graceful line of her neck. "My mom still lives in the same house where I learned to ride a bike, where I built my first architectural model out of cardboard boxes in the backyard. She has photos of me at age 7, declaring I was going to design houses that would make everyone happy." "And did you? Make everyone happy with your designs?" His tone was teasing, but there was genuine interest beneath it. "Hardly. Turns out architecture is complicated, and happiness is even more complicated." She laughed, but there was a note of disappointment in it that he caught immediately. "I worked for Harrison and Associates for 3 years, designing luxury condos and office buildings for people who already had too much money. Beautiful work, technically excellent, completely soulless." "What happened?" Gavin leaned forward, genuinely invested in her story, in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "The firm went under 6 months ago. Bad investments, worse management, and suddenly I am unemployed with a specialized skill set and a mountain of student loans." She shrugged, trying to make it sound casual, but he could hear the worry beneath her attempt at nonchalance. "Now I freelance when I can find work, which is not often, and spend my evenings wondering if I should have become a teacher, like my mother always suggested." "What about you?" she asked, clearly wanting to change the subject away from her financial struggles. "Boston, you said?" "Born there, raised there until I was 12. Then my parents divorced and everything changed." His expression grew more serious, and Skylar noticed the way his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "My mother moved to California. My father stayed in Boston with his new family. I spent high school being shuttled back and forth, never quite belonging anywhere. Is that why you build homes now? Trying to create the stability you never had?" The question was so perceptive, so unexpectedly intimate, that Gavin actually paused mid-sip. No one had ever made that connection before, not even his therapist during those mandatory sessions after his last relationship imploded. "Maybe," he said slowly. I never thought about it that way, but maybe you are right. Stanford for undergrad, MIT for my master's degree, then 5 years working for other people's companies before I started Vertex Green. He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. But I have been thinking about relocating my main operations here. San Diego has this energy, this possibility. What he did not say was that the possibility he was thinking about was sitting directly across from him, gesturing animatedly as she described her vision for sustainable community development. What he did not mention was that he had already made 3 phone calls to his assistant about extending his stay in the city, cancelling his flight back to Silicon Valley, and researching real estate options in North Park and Hillcrest. Their conversation was interrupted by Skylar's phone, buzzing insistently against the wooden table. She glanced at the screen, and her face immediately clouded, all the warmth and animation draining from her expression in seconds. I am sorry. I need to take this. It is my mum. Gavin watched as her entire demeanor shifted during the brief call. Her voice became soft and soothing, the voice of someone accustomed to managing crisis and providing comfort. When she hung up, her hands were trembling slightly, and she looked suddenly fragile in a way that made his chest ache. Everything okay? He asked gently, resisting the urge to reach across the table and cover her shaking hands with his own. My mother had another episode last night. Her heart condition, the medical bills are just... She stopped herself, clearly uncomfortable sharing such personal information with someone she had just met. Her professional mask was sliding back into place, but he had already seen behind it. I am sorry. You do not need to hear about my problems. This is supposed to be a conversation about architecture, not my family drama. But Gavin was listening intently, his business mind already calculating numbers, while his heart, an organ he thought he had successfully compartmentalized years ago, responded to the genuine distress in her voice. How serious is her condition? Serious enough that she needs a procedure she cannot afford, and I cannot afford, and insurance is fighting us every step of the way. Skylar's voice was tight with frustration and fear. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 10, worked 2 jobs to put me through college, never complained, never asked for anything, and now I cannot even help her when she needs me most. The raw honesty in her admission hit him harder than he expected. Here was someone who understood responsibility, sacrifice, love, that showed up in practical ways rather than grand gestures. Someone who knew what it meant to put family before personal ambition. What kind of procedure? He asked quietly. Cardiac ablation. Basically, they need to fix the electrical system in her heart. It is not experimental or risky, just expensive. $40,000 expensive. She laughed bitterly. Might as well be 40 million for all the good it does me. Gavin was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities, calculating risks and potential solutions. When he looked up, his expression was different, more focused, more determined. I might have a proposition for you, he said carefully. Something that could solve both our problems. The next morning, Skylar was reviewing resumes for freelance projects, a depressing exercise that mostly involved being overqualified for jobs that paid too little, when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. Miss Little, this is Miranda Stevens, personal assistant to Gavin Keller. Mr. Keller would like to offer you a consulting position on a special project. Are you available to meet this afternoon? Skylar's heart raced, hope and skepticism warring in her chest. A consulting job with Keller Industries could solve her immediate financial problems, and then some. It could mean her mother's surgery, her own financial stability, maybe even the chance to work on projects that actually mattered. Of course, what type of project are we discussing? Mr. Keller will explain everything in person. Shall we say 2 o'clock at the Pendry, San Diego? Top floor, conference room A. 3 hours later, Skylar stood in an elegant conference room overlooking the city, her portfolio clutched in suddenly sweaty palms. The view was breathtaking. The Pacific stretched endlessly westward, while downtown San Diego bustled below like a living architectural model. Coronado Bridge arced gracefully across the bay, and she could see the red roofs of the Hotel del Coronado gleaming in the afternoon sun. But when Gavin entered the room, the view became irrelevant. He looked different than he had at the coffee shop. More formal, more guarded, as if he had spent the intervening hours rebuilding his professional walls. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with mathematical precision, and his expression was carefully neutral. Only his eyes gave him away. There was something almost anxious in them as he studied her face. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone more formal than it had been over coffee. "Please sit down. What I am about to propose will sound unconventional." Skylar settled into the leather chair across from him, trying to project confidence she did not feel. The conference table between them was polished to a mirror shine, and she could see her own reflection looking back at her, wide-eyed, nervous, completely out of place in this world of power lunches and million-dollar deals. "I am listening," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Gavin took a deep breath, and for a moment his polished exterior cracked. She caught a glimpse of the man from the coffee shop, uncertain, almost vulnerable, before the CEO mask slid back into place. "I need you to pretend to be my fiancé." The words hung in the air like a challenge to gravity. Skylar blinked twice, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, what?" Gavin's jaw tightened, and she could see him retreat further behind his business persona. "I have a meeting next week with potential investors from Japan. Traditional conservative businessmen who believe that unmarried executives lack the stability necessary for long-term partnerships. They view marriage as a sign of maturity, commitment, reliability. I need a fiancé, temporarily." "This is insane," Skylar said flatly, but she did not stand up to leave. Something in his expression told her there was more to this story, layers she had not yet uncovered. "Why me? You must know dozens of women who would jump at the chance to play this part. Because you are brilliant, authentic, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. Because when you challenged me yesterday, you saw through every polished facade I have spent years perfecting." He leaned forward, his green eyes intense and focused entirely on her. "And because I trust you." The admission seemed to surprise them both. Skylar studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only sincerity and something that looked almost like vulnerability. "What exactly would this involve?" she heard herself asking, though her logical mind was screaming at her to walk away from this ridiculous proposition. 6 months. We would live together in my penthouse, attend social events, convince everyone that we are planning a future together. You would have your own bedroom, your own space, complete privacy when you need it. The compensation would be substantial, enough to cover your mother's medical expenses and provide you with financial security to start your own firm. Skylar's breath caught. Her mother's surgery, her own dreams of independence. It was everything she needed, wrapped in the most ridiculous proposal she had ever heard. "How much are we talking about?" she asked, hating herself for the mercenary question, but needing to know the scope of this offer. $200,000, half up front, half when the contract is complete. He slid a folder across the table toward her. Plus living expenses, a clothing allowance for public appearances, and health insurance that would cover your mother's procedure immediately. The numbers were staggering. More money than she had ever imagined having. Enough to transform not just her immediate circumstances, but her entire future. She opened the folder with trembling fingers, scanning the preliminary contract terms. Everything was there in black and white. Payment schedules, confidentiality clauses, termination conditions. "This is not a romantic comedy, Mr. Keller. This is my life." "I know," he said quietly, and for the first time since entering the room, his voice carried the warmth she remembered from their coffee date. "And I would not ask if I had any other choice. But I need this deal, Skylar. My company employs over 2,000 people globally. This expansion into the Asian market could create jobs, provide sustainable housing solutions for communities that desperately need them. We are talking about revolutionary technology, buildings that generate their own power, water reclamation systems, modular construction that can adapt to climate change. It is bigger than just me. She found herself actually considering it, which was perhaps the most shocking part of this entire surreal conversation. And what happens to your reputation when we break up in 6 months? We will handle that when the time comes. The relationship simply did not work out. These things happen, even to people who seem perfect for each other. His expression was carefully neutral, but she caught something almost sad in his tone. No scandal, no drama, just two people who discovered they wanted different things from life. Skylar stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Below, the city spread out like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her mother's worried face flashed through her mind, followed by her own dreams of creating meaningful architecture that could actually help people instead of just enriching those who already had everything. "I would need some ground rules," she said finally, not turning around. She could hear the relief in his voice when he responded. "Of course, whatever you need. Separate bedrooms. Complete honesty about the business arrangement. No emotional manipulation or blurred lines. Regular check-ins to make sure we are both comfortable with how things are progressing. And when this is over, we walk away cleanly. No drama, no complications, no attempts to extend the arrangement." Agreed. She turned to face him then, this stranger who was offering to solve her problems in exchange for solving his. He was watching her with an expression that was part hope, part determination, and part something she could not quite identify. "When do we start?" "Tonight. I will send a car to pick you up at 7. Pack for a week. We have events to attend, people to convince." He stood as well, extending his hand formally across the conference table. "Welcome to the team, fiancé." As she shook his hand, Skylar wondered what she had just agreed to. His grip was firm and warm, and she found herself noticing details, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, the faint scent of his cologne, the fact that his confidence seemed to waver just slightly when he looked at her. "One more thing," she said as they reached the door. "What is our story? How did we meet? How long have we been together? What made you fall in love with me?" Gavin paused, his hand on the door handle. "We met at the conference yesterday. You challenged me. I was intrigued. We went for coffee and talked for hours. I've never met anyone who understood my work the way you do, who shared my passion for sustainable development, who made me want to be better than I thought I could be." His voice grew softer, more thoughtful. "As for what made me fall in love with you, I think that part might be easier to fake than either of us expects." That evening, as she packed her suitcase with hands that shook only slightly, Skylar tried to convince herself that this was just business, just a job with unusual parameters. She had no way of knowing that in 3 hours she would be standing in Gavin's penthouse kitchen, sharing take-out Chinese food and laughing at his terrible attempts to use chopsticks. She had no way of knowing that their first real conversation as fake fiancés would last until 3 in the morning, or that she would fall asleep on his couch while he covered her with a blanket and wondered what the hell he had gotten himself into. Living with Gavin Keller was nothing like Skylar had expected. She had prepared herself for awkward formality, for maintaining careful distance while playing a part. What she had not prepared for was discovering that he made terrible coffee but excellent pancakes, that he talked to his plants every morning like they were old friends, that he fell asleep reading architecture journals on the couch most nights, and that he hummed off-key show tunes in the shower at precisely 6:30 every morning. "You know you have a perfectly good bed, right?" she asked one Thursday morning, finding him still sprawled across the living room furniture, a copy of Architectural Digest serving as an impromptu pillow. The magazine cover had left interesting geometric patterns pressed into his cheek, and his usually perfect hair stuck up at angles that defied both gravity and styling products. He stirred, blinking up at her with sleepy confusion. In the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, his eyes looked more grey than green, and there was something endearingly vulnerable about the way he looked when he first woke up. unguarded, almost boyish. "Could not sleep," he mumbled, sitting up and stretching. His t-shirt had ridden up during the night, revealing a strip of tanned skin that made Skylar's breath catch unexpectedly. "Too much on my mind." The Fujimoto meeting. The Japanese investors were arriving next week, which meant their first real test as a couple was rapidly approaching. They had been practicing their story, refining the details of their supposed romance, but Skylar still felt woefully unprepared for the scrutiny they would face. Among other things, his eyes found hers, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with business arrangements and everything to do with the way the morning light caught in her sleep-tousled hair, the way her oversized Stanford t-shirt, borrowed from his closet, made her look young and beautiful and completely at home in his space. "Coffee." "I will make it," Skylar said quickly, needing an excuse to break the intensity of his gaze. "Your coffee could wake the dead, and not in a good way." As she moved around his kitchen, their kitchen, she corrected herself, though the possessive pronoun felt dangerous, she tried to ignore how natural this felt, how right it seemed to be sharing this space with him, even if it was all pretend. Over the past 3 weeks, she had learned that he preferred his eggs over easy, that he hummed off-key in the shower, that he had never learned to properly fold laundry despite living alone for years, and that he got genuinely excited about things like sustainable concrete mixtures and solar panel efficiency ratings. She had also learned that he was funny in unexpected ways, that he listened to terrible pop music when he thought no one was around, that he called his brother every Sunday without fail, and that he had a habit of bringing home stray things, plants from closing garden centers, furniture from estate sales, once even a cat that had wandered onto his balcony, though the cat had ultimately decided it preferred his neighbor's apartment. "Skylar," he said suddenly, his voice serious enough to make her look up from the coffee maker, "about tonight." She turned to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Tonight was their first public appearance as a couple, a charity gala for sustainable housing initiatives hosted by the San Diego Architecture Foundation. The irony was not lost on either of them that their fake relationship would be debuting at an event celebrating the very cause that had brought them together. What about it? People are going to be watching us closely, looking for cracks in the story, inconsistencies in our body language, signs that we are not what we claim to be. He paused, running a hand through his already messy hair. "We need to be convincing, really convincing." "I think I can manage to pretend to like you for a few hours," she said lightly, but her pulse quickened at the thought of being pressed close to him on a dance floor, of having to look lovingly into his eyes, while an audience of San Diego's architectural elite watched for signs of deception. "That is not what I am worried about," he said quietly, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. Before she could ask what he meant, his phone rang. Business calls, meetings, the constant demands of running a global company, these interruptions had become part of their routine. But as she watched him shift into CEO mode, his voice becoming crisp and commanding as he discussed supply chain logistics with someone in Singapore, she realized she was beginning to prefer the softer version of him that emerged in the quiet moments between the demands of his professional life. That evening, as Skylar stood in front of the bedroom mirror, she barely recognized herself. The black dress Gavin had insisted on buying her after a surprisingly heated argument about accepting gifts. Fit like a dream, elegant and sophisticated, without being flashy. The designer had somehow managed to create something that was both timelessly classic and utterly contemporary, with clean lines that flattered her figure and a neckline that was conservative enough for business, but intriguing enough to suggest there was more to discover. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, styled by a professional who had arrived at the penthouse that afternoon, with enough equipment to supply a small salon. The makeup artist, also Gavin's idea, also initially resisted, had somehow made her eyes look mysterious and alluring, while still looking like herself, just enhanced. "You look beautiful," came his voice from the doorway, and when she turned, her breath caught. Gavin, in a tuxedo, was devastating enough, but the way he was looking at her, as if seeing her for the first time, as if she was something precious and unexpected, made her knees weak. "Thank you," she managed, trying to remember that none of this was real, that the admiration in his eyes was just part of the performance they were about to give, even though something about his expression suggested it was entirely genuine. The gala was held at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and from the moment they stepped out of the car, a sleek Tesla that whispered rather than roared, Skylar felt the weight of curious stares. San Diego's architectural community was smaller than those in Los Angeles or San Francisco, which meant everyone knew everyone, and the appearance of Gavin Keller with an unknown woman on his arm was bound to generate speculation. Gavin's hand found the small of her back, warm and steadying, as they made their way through the crowd. His touch was light but possessive, the kind of casual intimacy that suggested long familiarity and mutual comfort. "Remember," he whispered in her ear, his breath sending unexpected shivers down her spine, "we are madly in love." "Right," she whispered back, turning to smile up at him with an expression that felt surprisingly natural. Madly in love. But as the evening progressed, something strange began to happen. The act stopped feeling like an act. When Gavin introduced her to his colleagues, his pride seemed genuine. When they danced, his hands lingered on her waist, as if he never wanted to let her go. And when she caught him watching her during dinner, the expression on his face was tender and unguarded in a way that made her heart race with dangerous possibilities. "You are very good at this," she murmured, as they swayed together during the final dance of the evening, her body fitting perfectly against his, as if they had been dancing together for years. "So are you," he replied, but his voice was rough, uncertain. "Sometimes I almost forget." "Forget what?" His eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought he might say something that would change everything between them. Instead, he simply pulled her closer, and she could feel his heart beating against her chest, as rapid and confused as her own. The morning after the gala, everything felt different. Skylar woke to find a note from Gavin, saying he had gone for an early run, and she spent the next hour replaying every moment from the night before. The way he had looked at her, touched her, held her as they danced. None of it had felt like pretending. The compliments from his colleagues had seemed genuine, their chemistry had felt electric, and when Mrs. Henderson from the Architecture Foundation had commented on how wonderful it was to see Gavin so happy, his smile had been radiant and completely unguarded. When he returned, sweaty and breathing hard from what had clearly been a punishing run along the harbour, she was sitting at the kitchen island with her coffee and her laptop, trying to focus on work emails instead of the way his running shirt clung to his chest, or the way his hair curled slightly when it was damp with perspiration. "Good run?" she asked, proud of how normal her voice sounded, despite the fact that her pulse had accelerated the moment he walked through the door. "Needed to clear my head," he replied, grabbing a water bottle from the refrigerator. There was something tense about his posture, something almost angry in the way he moved. "The Fujimoto team lands this afternoon. Are you nervous?" He turned to look at her then, his green eyes intense and troubled. "About the meeting? No. About everything else? Absolutely." Before she could ask what he meant, his phone rang. It was Miranda, his assistant, with updates about the investor's arrival, changes to the dinner reservation, last-minute adjustments to the presentation materials. But as he spoke, Skylar noticed the way his free hand kept clenching and unclenching, the way his jaw remained tight throughout the conversation, the way he kept glancing at her as if she were a puzzle he could not solve. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Gavin disappeared into his home office for video conferences, while Skylar tried to focus on her own work, a small residential project that was actually starting to take interesting shape. But concentration proved impossible when she could hear his voice through the walls, passionate and persuasive, as he discussed sustainable building technologies with potential partners in Singapore, his excitement about innovation and environmental responsibility evident even through a closed door. At 3 o'clock, they stood together in the lobby of the Grand Del Mar, waiting for the Japanese delegation. Skylar wore a navy dress that struck the perfect balance between professional and feminine, while Gavin looked every inch the successful businessman in his charcoal suit. But she could feel the tension radiating from him, see the way his hands moved restlessly, adjusting his tie, checking his watch, smoothing his already perfect hair. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hotel lobby's ambient noise, "we have been together for 8 months. We met at a conference, fell in love over shared interests in sustainable design. We are planning to announce our engagement publicly next month after your mother's surgery is complete and you feel ready to handle the media attention." "Got it," Skylar replied, then caught his hand in hers without thinking. The contact seemed to calm him instantly, his breathing deepening, his shoulders relaxing. "Gavin, breathe. You are going to be fine. This is your life's work, your passion. They would be idiots not to see how brilliant you are." When he looked down at their joined hands, something shifted in his expression. "When did you become so good at reading me?" Before she could answer, the delegation arrived. Mr. Fujimoto was exactly as Gavin had described. Traditional, formal, and intensely observant. His colleagues flanked him like a well-dressed battalion, and Skylar felt their collective scrutiny as Gavin made introductions. She was grateful for her morning of research, for the crash course in Japanese business etiquette that had felt excessive at the time, but now seemed essential. "Mr. Fujimoto, I would like you to meet my fiancée, Skylar Little. Skylar is an accomplished architect specializing in sustainable community development." The older man bowed politely, and Skylar returned the gesture with exactly the right depth and duration. "It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Fujimoto. Gavin speaks of you with tremendous respect, and I have been looking forward to learning more about your innovative approaches to urban development in Tokyo." Dinner was an elaborate affair at the hotel's finest restaurant, and Skylar found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation about international construction standards, environmental policy, and the challenges of building sustainable communities in densely populated urban areas. But she was acutely aware of how closely the Japanese team was watching her and Gavin together, looking for signs of authenticity in their relationship, studying their body language for inconsistencies. "How did you know Gavin was the one?" asked Mr. Fujimoto's translator, a younger woman named Yuki, during a brief lull in the business discussion. Skylar felt her heart skip, but when she glanced at Gavin, he nodded encouragingly. "It was actually something he said during our first real conversation," she replied, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "He told me that he would rather be challenged than flattered, that he wanted someone who would make him better, not just make him comfortable. I had never met anyone who understood that growth requires discomfort, that the best relationships push you to become more than you thought you could be." Gavin's eyes widened slightly at her honesty. But Mr. Fujimoto looked pleased. "Wise words. Strong partnerships require honest communication, even when that communication is difficult." "Exactly," Gavin said, his voice warm as he looked at Skylar. "She makes me better every day, challenges me to think differently, to consider perspectives I would never have seen on my own. I am a better businessman, a better person, because of her." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard, and for a moment she forgot they were performing. This felt real. This felt like something worth fighting for, something worth building a life around. Later that night, after the investors had returned to their hotel and the preliminary contracts had been signed and the champagne had been opened to celebrate what Gavin called the biggest deal of my career, Skylar and Gavin stood together on his penthouse balcony, looking out over the city lights. "We did it," she said softly, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and possibility. "They believe us." "Yes," he replied, but there was no celebration in his voice. Instead, he sounded almost sad, melancholy in a way that made her want to comfort him. 6 months from now, this will all be over. The reminder hit her like a physical blow. 6 months. Suddenly, it seemed like no time at all, an impossibly short window for something that was beginning to feel infinite and essential. "Gavin," she began, but he was already turning away from the railing, his expression unreadable in the dim light cast by the city below. "I should let you get some rest," he said formally, the warmth from dinner completely gone from his voice. "Thank you for tonight. You were perfect. Absolutely perfect." As he disappeared into the penthouse, leaving her alone with the ocean breeze and her racing thoughts, Skylar realized that somewhere between the first night and this moment, everything had changed. She was no longer pretending to be in love with Gavin Keller. She was just in love with him, really, truly, helplessly in love, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The next morning brought complications neither of them had anticipated. Skylar woke to find Gavin already dressed for work, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression grim. She caught fragments of his conversation, something about media attention, leaked information, damage control, and her stomach sank. "What happened?" she asked when he finally hung up. "Someone took photos of us at the gala. They are already online, along with speculation about our relationship." He showed her his phone screen, where a gossip blog displayed pictures of them dancing, her head tilted back in laughter, his hands spanning her waist possessively. The headline read, "Tech Billionaires' Secret Romance. Who is Gavin Keller's mystery woman?" "Is this bad?" she asked, though she could tell from his expression that it was. "It is not ideal. The Fujimoto team values discretion, privacy. They will not appreciate having their business associate's personal life splashed across the internet." He ran a hand through his hair, destroying its careful styling. "Miranda is working on damage control, but we need to be prepared for increased scrutiny." The increased scrutiny came in the form of Veronica Telles, Gavin's head of public relations, who arrived at the penthouse an hour later with a tablet full of articles, a laptop, and an expression that could have frozen lava. "Gavin, we need to talk," she said without preamble, her eyes flicking dismissively over Skylar. Privately, Veronica was everything Skylar was not. Tall, blonde, perfectly polished, with the kind of sharp beauty that photographed well and intimidated effortlessly. She moved through Gavin's space with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before, and something about the way she looked at him made Skylar's chest tighten with an emotion she refused to name. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Skylar," Gavin replied firmly, his hand finding the small of Skylar's back in a gesture that felt protective rather than performative. "Fine." Veronica's smile was sharp as a blade. "The photos are everywhere. Business Insider, TechCrunch, even the Wall Street Journal picked up the story. Everyone wants to know who Skylar Little is, where she came from, why you have been hiding your relationship." "We were not hiding anything," Skylar said quietly. "We simply prefer to keep our personal life private." "Private?" Veronica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Gavin, you are a public figure. Your company is publicly traded. Your personal life affects stock prices, investor confidence, business partnerships. You cannot just surprise everyone with a serious relationship without considering the implications. What are you suggesting?" Gavin's voice was dangerously quiet. "A proper introduction, interviews, photo shoots, social media presence. If you are going to be public about this relationship, we need to control the narrative." Veronica's eyes fixed on Skylar with calculating intensity. "Of course, that assumes Miss Little is prepared for that level of scrutiny. Not everyone is cut out for life in the public eye." The challenge was clear, and Skylar felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "I think I can handle whatever comes our way." "Can you? Because dating Gavin means having your entire life dissected by strangers. Your financial history, your family, your past relationships, everything becomes fair game. Are you prepared for photographers following you to the grocery store? For bloggers analyzing every outfit you wear? For people questioning whether you are with him for love or money?" Each question hit like a small slap, designed to make Skylar doubt herself, to make her run. But instead of retreating, she stepped closer to Gavin, her chin lifting with stubborn determination. "I think you underestimate me, Miss Tellez. And more importantly, you underestimate Gavin's ability to choose someone strong enough to handle whatever challenges come our way." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, but before anyone could respond, Gavin's phone rang again. This time it was his brother Ethan calling from Portland, and his conversation was brief but concerning. "We have another problem," he said when he hung up. "The story has reached the Portland Tribune. Someone connected you to your mother's medical situation, Skylar. They are spinning it as a potential gold digger narrative." Skylar felt the blood drain from her face. This was exactly what she had feared. Her private struggles becoming public fodder, her motives questioned, her mother dragged into a situation she had never asked for. "I should go," she said quietly. "This is getting too complicated, too public. I never signed up for this level of exposure." "No!" Gavin's voice was firm, final. "You are not going anywhere. We are going to face this together just like we planned." But as Skylar looked between Gavin's determined expression and Veronica's satisfied smirk, she wondered if staying was the right choice, or if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Epilogue. 1 year later, Skylar stood in the same conference room where Gavin had first proposed their fake engagement, but this time the view looked entirely different. The Pacific still stretched endlessly westward, but now she saw possibility instead of uncertainty, hope instead of desperation. The space itself had changed too. Gavin had moved his primary offices to San Diego 6 months ago, and this room now served as the heart of Vertex Green's West Coast operations. "Mrs. Keller," came a familiar voice from behind her, and she turned to find her husband, her real husband, standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that still made her heart race after all this time. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the gold of his wedding ring, a simple band that matched her own. "I like the sound of that," she replied, accepting the cup he offered. The coffee was perfect. He had finally learned to make it properly after months of her patient instruction. "How did the call with the Tokyo office go?" "Perfectly. The community housing project is ahead of schedule and under budget." He moved to stand beside her at the window, his free hand finding hers naturally. "Your design modifications have saved them millions while actually improving functionality. The modular units are testing even better than we projected for earthquake resistance." 6 months after their fake engagement was supposed to end, neither of them had been able to walk away. The night before their breakup was scheduled, Gavin had appeared at her apartment door. She had moved back to her own place as their contract neared its end, with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant and a confession that had changed everything. "I love you," he had said simply, standing in her doorway like a man preparing for battle. "Not the version of you that exists for investors or public appearances. I love the real you, the woman who challenges me, who makes me laugh, who falls asleep reading architecture journals and talks to my plants when she thinks I'm not listening. I love that you take your coffee with exactly 2 sugars and that you hum when you're concentrating. I love that you cry at animal rescue commercials and that you call your mother every single day without fail." The media storm that had erupted around their relationship had been intense but brief. Veronica had eventually been forced to admit that their chemistry was undeniably genuine, and the public had quickly embraced their love story. The fact that Skylar had genuinely improved Gavin's business, her community-focused approach had opened new markets and partnerships, had silenced most critics. Their real wedding had been small and perfect, held in her mother's backyard in Normal Heights, with fairy lights strung between the old jacaranda trees, and Zeka, her mother's ancient corgi, serving as an unofficial ring-bearer. Mrs. Duarte, now healthy after her successful surgery and glowing with happiness, had cried tears of joy, while Marcella had grudgingly admitted that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about Gavin's intentions. "The surgery went well, by the way," Skylar said, settling into the chair behind what was now her desk. 3 months ago, Gavin had surprised her by offering her a partnership in Vertex Green, making her the company's first director of community development. Dr. Martinez says Mom's heart is stronger than it has been in years. I am glad. She deserves all the happiness in the world. Gavin perched on the edge of her desk, a habit that had developed during their fake engagement and continued into their real marriage. Speaking of happiness, I have something to tell you. Good news or bad news. Depends on how you feel about expansion. His eyes were bright with excitement, the expression he got when he was about to propose something ambitious and slightly crazy. The success of the San Diego project has caught attention in Sacramento. They want us to design affordable housing communities throughout California. How big are we talking? 50,000 units over the next 5 years. Completely sustainable, community integrated, designed to actual livability standards instead of just meeting minimum requirements. He pulled out his phone, showing her architectural mock-ups and budget projections. It would mean hiring more staff, opening satellite offices, probably some significant travel for both of us. Skylar studied the plans, her architect's eye immediately seeing the potential and the challenges. This is huge, Gavin. This could change everything. I know. That is why I wanted to discuss it with you before giving them an answer. His expression grew serious, tender. I do not want to make any major decisions without considering how they affect us, our life together, our future plans. She looked at this man who had started as a stranger, offering a business proposition, and had become her partner in every sense of the word. Over the past year, she had watched him grow from someone who compartmentalized his emotions to someone who shared his fears and dreams with openness that still amazed her. He had supported her through her mother's recovery, celebrated her professional successes as if they were his own, and somehow made her feel like the most important person in his world, even when he was juggling international business deals. "What do you think?" she asked, curious about his own feelings about the expansion. "I think it sounds like the kind of project we got into this business to do. Real impact, lasting change, communities that will thrive instead of just survive." He paused, studying her face. "But I also think it sounds like something that could easily consume our lives if we are not careful." "Are you worried about us? About the pressure affecting our relationship?" "No," he said immediately, then reconsidered. "Maybe a little. We have built something really good here, Skylar. Something real and strong and worth protecting. I do not want to lose that in pursuit of the next big thing." She stood up, moving to stand between his knees where he sat on her desk. "Do you remember what you told me that first night we lived together? When we were eating terrible Chinese takeout and you were trying to explain why your last relationship failed? I said I had a tendency to let work consume everything else in my life," he replied, his hands settling naturally on her waist. "And what did I tell you? That the right partnership would enhance your work instead of competing with it. That love should make you better at everything else, not worse." His smile was soft, remembering. "You said that if someone truly understood your passion, they would help you pursue it more effectively, not resent it." "Exactly. So the question is not whether this project will be demanding. Of course it will be. The question is whether we can take it on together as a team, supporting each other through the challenges." Gavin pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "When did you get so wise about relationships?" "I had a good teacher," she replied, thinking of all the late-night conversations, the patient explanations, the way he had shown her through actions what healthy love looked like. "Besides, I have a vested interest in making sure this partnership succeeds. I happen to be rather fond of my business partner." "Just fond?" he asked, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. "Completely, utterly, ridiculously in love with," she corrected, and watched his expression transform into something so tender it made her chest ache with happiness. As he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, Skylar marveled at how perfectly wrong she had been about almost everything. She had thought it was just a contract, just a temporary solution to both their problems. She had believed that love was something that happened gradually, safely, with plenty of warning signs and logical progression. Instead, she had learned that sometimes love arrives disguised as convenience, that the best partnerships begin with honest challenges, and that the most authentic connections can grow from the most artificial circumstances. She had discovered that real love was not about finding someone who completed you, but about finding someone who inspired you to become more complete yourself. When they broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Gavin pressed his forehead against hers. "So, Mrs. Keller, what do you think? Ready for the next adventure?" Skylar looked into his eyes, those green eyes that had first challenged her, then charmed her, and finally captured her completely, and felt her heart expand with certainty and excitement for whatever came next. "With you?" she said, echoing the words she had spoken on their wedding day. "I am ready for anything." Outside the window, San Diego sprawled beneath them in all its complicated beauty, a city of dreamers and builders, of second chances and new beginnings. And somewhere in a small house in Normal Heights, Skylar's mother was probably telling anyone who would listen about how her daughter had found love in the most unexpected place, how a fake engagement had led to the most real happiness either of them had ever known. Because sometimes the best stories begin with the most impossible premises. Sometimes fake becomes real, contracts become promises, and two people who think they are just solving problems end up creating something beautiful together. Sometimes love disguises itself as business until the moment when pretending becomes unnecessary, and two hearts recognize what they have been searching for all along. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, that recognition leads not to an ending but to a beginning, the first chapter of a love story that will be written over decades, through challenges and triumphs, building something lasting and true, one day at a time. As Skylar and Gavin stood together, planning their future and dreaming of the communities they would build, the homes they would create, the lives they would impact, they knew they had found something rare and precious, a partnership that made them both better, stronger, more capable of changing the world than either could have been alone. And that, they agreed, was worth everything.